Good evening. Lali Mohammed here from Deviant Productions, where we join you at the 519 Community Center for the Iftar Ramadan dinner hosted by Salam. Beside me, I'm joined by Dr. Amina Wadud, Islamic feminist scholar visiting. Good afternoon. Good evening, rather.
Good evening. Such a pleasure to be here.
What are you doing in Toronto this weekend?
Well, I came as a guest by my friend el-farouk el-kaki, particularly to be a part of the Salam Iftar, the largest queer gathering of Muslims I know about in the world, and our bridge to people who are not Muslim or not queer who want to join in with our celebration.
Well, we're really excited to have you. You're known throughout the world to be the first woman to lead prayer. What does that mean for you?
Well, technically I'm not the first, but there was a conscious effort to make public our understanding about the theological possibility of women as imams. So in that sense, it was the first announced Juma that a woman was leading the prayer for, and it's been a part of my long-term work on gender justice in Islam. And since there is nothing in the Quran that specifies that it has to be a man, and nothing that prohibits it from being a woman, nothing that the Prophet has said that says it has to be a man, nothing that the Prophet said that prohibits it from being a woman. What we're up against instead is sort of a series of interpretations that have been given 100% by men who have decided to close off the possibility from women.
I'm talking about expanding possibilities. As a feminist and as an ally to the LGBT community, what other things are you trying to expand?
Well, one of the things that I'm trying to advocate at multiple levels is an understanding of what I call radical pluralism. Pluralism and diversity have become catchwords in some national agendas, but they always seem to say that we're plural because we're going to include one or two others. But to get radical pluralism, something that I really came to understand from Audre Lorde, who is a black feminist lesbian writer, one of the things I came to understand from her caused me to insert the word radical when I talk about pluralism, because pluralism is not just me and those people with whom I'm comfortable, but pluralism is actually learning to embrace the other. And for me, this is again something that I've developed in terms of a basic theology of oneness based on Tawheed, or the oneness of God, and that no person can be in a relationship to any other person except of equality and reciprocity.
I'm wondering, where did we go wrong then? If those interpretations aren't there right now, is it patriarchy? Is it homophobia? Is it misogyny? Like, where did we go wrong in those interpretations that won't allow these possibilities to occur or to flourish?
You know, I have a sort of running theory about patriarchy, and that is that patriarchy was necessary to get us out of the caves. But now that we're out of the caves, patriarchy will destroy us as a civilization, because we have to learn to power share, we have to learn to embrace the other. So I think that misogyny, homophobia all extend from patriarchy, which is a kind of domination. It's a kind of I am better than, or one person over another for reasons of gender. And sometimes it extends to other things, class and race.
Do you think there are like sort of tactics and strategies to sort of like resist this, or do we need more vocal scholars who take a feminist point of view, or what do you think we need?
Actually, I have found that we need multiple strategies. For example, I do theology. I'm really interested in notions of God and how that interacts with our ethical framework as human beings. But I work with people who do law, both Islamic law and constitutional law, because sometimes you need explicit legal reforms. So you have to have somebody who can not only advocate, but who can develop those reforms to such an extent that they can create that kind of change. But you need people who are activists, that is, people who are on the ground, who are working to be able to make certain changes, and who may not think about the theory that goes behind it. So I'm really into what I call the multi-pronged approach, in order that the one thing about which I am not conditional is justice. That in the traditional development of Islamic Sharia, the maqasid, the objective of Sharia is supposed to be justice. And what we've found is that if that justice is not lived today in our community, with all the diversity of our community, then we have to challenge any policy, any practice, any private, sort of arrangement that allows for injustice to go on, because we find that those things are antithetical to our goal. So it's a very interesting thing to realize that my method is only one method that contributes to the holistic transformation of our community.
You mentioned the fantastic and always progressive for her times, Miss Audre Lorde, but where else do you get your inspiration from your ideas of justice?
Well, you know what? My father, who was a Methodist minister, took me to the March on Washington with Martin Luther King when I was like 10, 11 years old. So I've always been raised with the relationship between faith and freedom, the relationship between justice and God. I was raised on that. And no less than coming into Islam, where that articulation is explicit in the Quran. So actually my inspiration is pretty sacred. It's really about the way in which I believe in God, and the way in which I believe that it is then necessary to act in life the way that I believe that God would want me to act, and that is for justice, equality, and dignity.
When did you convert, and what was that process like for you?
I converted actually on Thanksgiving Day in 1972, probably before you were born.
Just by a couple of years.
Yeah. And I had been a seeker. I was very much inspired by my father, a man of ethics and faith. But in college, I also practiced Buddhism and lived in a Buddhist ashram. So I was really seeking. And when I came to Islam, I was really very interested in learning about it, and ended up taking Shahada, I think, before I can say I was truly converted, but I kept reading, and 4 or 5 months later, coincidentally, this is the order of things, 4 or 5 months later, somebody gave me a copy of the Quran. And when I read the Quran, I was like, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ, this is the book. And I began learning Arabic and studying it intensely, lived in Arabic-speaking countries, and dedicated myself to the process of being able to understand it, which led to working on the first book that I wrote, Quran and Woman, rereading the sacred text from a woman's perspective.
What is the premise of your first book?
The premise of my first book is women and men are equally part of the Muslim Ummah or community, were equally present at the time of the revelation of the Quran, but for some reason the history of women's voices with regard to the sacred text is completely silent. And I know they had thoughts, but we don't have a record of it, but that it is integral to our understanding of divine revelation that we include the perspectives of both women and men in our understanding of the text. So in other words, it was what you call self-evident. It is evident that women have a perspective, and it is evident that that perspective helps us to understand the divine revelation.
In more nuanced ways that were missing earlier, right?
In certain nuanced ways. I mean, when the Quran talks about Mary's experience in labor, men have never been in labor, so why are they thinking that they're the ones going to give the interpretation of that experience exclusively? Yeah. You see, we understand more because the Quran also pays attention to women in a way that is beautiful, and yet and still the community sometimes shied away from being clear about how significant was the woman's experience to helping us to understand the text.
What's one of your perhaps favorite is not the word, but the thing you're most attached to with regards to Islam and the Quran?
The one thing is Tawheed. And I want to tell you a little bit about this because it was an experience of both spiritual, intellectual transformation that I began to look at Tawheed not just as the thing that means the oneness of God, but as the thing that mandates that we always treat other people with equality. And when I began to work on this again, just as a theologian, that is, as a way of envisioning the universe and my relationship with the Creator and therefore my relationship with others, when I began to work on it, as I said, I didn't do law, so I didn't know how would this impact the law. And I was actually asked about this. Well, how do you get that into fiqh? How do you make that into jurisprudence? And I thought, you guys do the law. Can't you do the law and let me just do the theology? It all feels so right, Yeah. But over the last 5 years or so, I've been working with people who are in fact versed with the law, and the understanding is that if the maqasid that we talked about earlier, if the goal of the Sharia is justice, then that justice must be experienced by the people who are supposed to be recipients of it. And in particular, in terms of dealing with gender, if we are not experiencing justice and equality, then we have to change any law or any policy that prevents us from being able to do it. And this has led to an interesting movement in the context of Muslim women activists across the globe.
Alhamdulillah. And there you have it. Leading Dr. Amina Wadud in Toronto, sharing her thoughts and passions and favorite things about Islam, gender, and LGBT Muslims. In solidarity, this is Lali Muhammad from Deviant Productions.